Welcome back. I'm here with our first Dole Fellow of 2020, Ron Marks. Ron, thanks for being here.
I'm delighted, thank you.
So for some of our students who may not know, tell me a little bit, what is a Dole Fellow?
Well, this is interesting. It was built on the Dole Institute, which is essentially a memorial to Senator Robert Dole and his wife, Senator Elizabeth Dole, and their involvement in Washington politics, which took, almost over 50 years now. The fellowships really have tried to focus on issues in Washington or issues of the politics of the day. In my case, what they wanted to do was have someone come in and talk about intelligence, but also information in the 21st century and how it's being used and how it's being analyzed and how it's being presented to different kinds of policy people, whether or not it's a senator or a president or a chief executive officer. But again, the idea was to have, and in my case, we're going to do a 7-part series, bring different experts in from different parts of cyber world, which is a big world, and talk a little bit about what it looks like now that we're in the total information age.
So what people do you plan on bringing back? What do you have planned for us?
Well, I cage as many of my friends as possible. So Jen McLaughlin, who is the national security correspondent for Yahoo, will be coming back. Stephanie Pell, who is assistant professor with Army Cyber at West Point, will be coming to talk about how military is dealing with this world. In addition, I will have Roy Hartsfield, who actually worked for CIA up until very recently, and she was the head of human resources for their Digital Innovation Directorate, to talk a little bit about what they're looking for now in the American intelligence community, which is sort of part of this grand world, and what kind of skill set they're looking for from people now. Also, a friend of mine, Randy Fort, who was the chief intelligence officer at U.S. State Department. He worked for Condoleezza Rice, and then a couple of other more senior guys who are senior analysts, both in the intelligence community and outside.
Okay.
Because one of the emphases on this is to make people understand that everybody talks about CIA for information and spying and all that.
Right.
But it's a big private sector area now, as well as the public sector.
Well, what is your background that got you to this point?
I was trying to follow a girl to Washington. Fair enough. My dad was a lobbyist. He worked primarily transportation issues because of his own background, and I got the Washington bug. I just love the idea of being able to come back to the Capitol, and a lobbyist is someone who represents you and works on a given issue and talks to senators and congressmen and staff to try to get your viewpoint across and to try to get either money or law together for whatever you're working on. And I got the bug, and I got the national security bug early just because I enjoyed national security issues. My parents had traveled extensively in Europe. So I really wanted to do that, and I was at the University of Oregon. I was working on my doctorate, and someone said the CIA was hiring economists. And I said, okay. And so it seemed to fit the bill. The CIA part was almost irrelevant, by the way. It was the Washington, D.C. part. And I'd had a girlfriend who dumped me and gone back to work on Capitol Hill, so there was another incentive there as well. But what I ended up doing was old-fashioned snail mail. I just sent him a letter, and I said, hey, I'm interested. And I was very fortunate because they were trying to hire people who understood the world of economics at the time. In particular, they were concerned about Latin America, had some debt problems and rescheduling of debt and all this kind of stuff. The Russians were still, they were our enemy then, and they've slipped back now, but in those days it was a function of how they're getting hard currency, because they couldn't convert their currency to the Western currency. So how are they doing that? So they needed guys like me who could come in and essentially try to explain to policy people, and by that it's sort of senators or congressmen or people in the executive branch or all these secretary names and all that, and even the president on occasion, what's happening here. And so that's it took me about a year because you go through a process of taking a polygraph and having all your friends spoken with, which is always sort of fun because they're all calling you at various times. This guy came by from DOD to kind of talk to me. So I came in, I started with about 11 months from start to finish.
Okay.
It was all said and done. But I had, it's funny because you never, in that process, you're always somewhat blind to it in the sense of you don't sort of know what's going on. In part because a lot of it has to do with how many positions they have available. and what kind of people they're looking for. So in those days, I'd have to put up with USA.gov, which is everybody's favorite website.
Of course.
But same version, same version. But I would advise anybody to do it. It was well worth the shot. I got lucky, but the fact of the matter was that it really was the experience of a lifetime. In 16 years, I met my wife there, who was an attorney. She stayed 34 years, did a lot of work in hunting down spies. So it gave me a career, gave me a life. I had a fascinating time with it, and eventually did some stuff in the private sector based on what I had learned there.
Well, what advice do you have for college students who are looking to follow in those footsteps?
It's funny because people, I've taught now on and off as an adjunct for years, and people ask that question. And I always wish I could give them a good answer for it. I think being willing to try different things, having traveled a little bit, I think helps to know and understand the world outside of where you live.
Right.
They always ask me, is there sort of the magic major? And the answer is not really. I mean, I knew guys who were English majors. I knew guys who were poli-sci majors. My wife's a poli-sci major. I was an economics major.
Okay. I
think the idea was to have, a real interest in whatever your topic was, know a little bit about international, but also, it's to some extent, it almost matters more that you were captain of your volleyball team, in the sense of that you can get along with people and cooperate. Because a lot of this, because of either the classified nature of it or even the private sector, you're working in a team all the time.
Right.
And the teamwork is crucial. And if you've got people that do that, that's great. It's not that you don't want individuals who are running around, but the world's worst spy is James Bond, because he's flashy. He does everything on his own. And you may trust me on this. If you're trying to take care of people like that, you get a stomach ulcer real fast, because that's not what you want. You want people who are real team players.
Well, I feel like that's with any job.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think people forget that sometimes.
Yeah.
It is a corporate organization, as you would in the private sector. I mean, I can't say the specific numbers, but the U.S. intelligence community is about $86 billion total for 16 agencies, and that's a Fortune 500 company. And publicly, I think it's 100,000 people, or 200,000 people, I think total is the number I've heard. So it's a big corporate organization, and if you're a young person coming in, the idea that you have someone who's ambitious and wants to do some different things. There's a wonderful line in the contract for the agency, and the line is, "and all other duties as may be assigned," which is about 90% of what you're going to do. Whatever they hire you for, because sometimes you have to be and flexibility. You'll get pulled off on something. Some other task force will come up. Something will happen somewhere in the world, and they're looking for volunteers. So that would be my advice. I think flexibility and intellectual interest, you can't beat it. I'd like to tell you that there's the magic key to get there, but that puts you in the game. Let's put it that way.
I know a lot of people go into college also not knowing what they want to do at all. Did you know right away, or was it halfway through your undergrad, or?
I think I knew I was going to come back to Washington. I knew that interest was there. What I didn't know at the time was that I dual majored at Lewis and Clark was my undergrad out in Portland. I dual majored in business and economics, and with minored in math. So I was really dull, and terribly dull. But the business part came in handy later on, because as I left the intelligence community, and I had used those managerial skills that I had learned, but again, I went into the private sector because there's a huge contract community that supports the intelligence community. There's only so much they can cover. That came in terribly handy. So the business side of it was a little bit of a surprise, but a pleasant one. The CIA part, to be brutally honest with you, I wouldn't have guessed that to save my life, honestly. It was a pure play of just taking an opportunity.
Yeah.
I think one of the real headaches, I really get it. 'Cause like I said, I've been adjuncting now, or actually, heading a department for on and off for about 16, 17 years. And the real headache is, you're stuck with a pile of debt. You got the parental units out there somewhere going, tick, 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 tick. How much longer is this going on? What do I want to do? Making that prediction at age 18, 19, 20 is really hard.
Yeah.
And it's not because you don't know stuff, it's just because you don't necessarily know the world yet. My suggestion to people always is if an opportunity comes up, take it. Or just say yes. I mean, if you're on board the train, you can argue what car you're on, but if you're standing on the platform and that Hummer rolls by, you're lost. So, my advice always is to look, if you've got an opportunity, it looks interesting to you, say yes. And if you don't like it, we live in a society where you could make a decision to leave. A lot of young people who go into the intelligence community nowadays will leave after 3 to 5 years. Part of it's because the nature of society now. I mean, Gen Z faces different issues than us okay boomers. So it's a different society now, and I think the intelligence community understands that, and so does private sector, by the way. But again, the idea of saying yes and being there, and I know it's hard sometimes because you're trying to, how am I going to make some money out of this thing? Am I going to have a career? That you just got to take a shot at it. That would be my recommendation. Just try to say yes and try to get in there.
Well, do you have anything else you'd like to add for our students?
Well, I would really, I would really like to make the pitch, if you can, to come to these seminars. I think you're really going to have these are really not only interesting, and these are top-notch guys in their field. I mean, we'll have the chairman of the National Intelligence Council, their former chairman, Greg Treverton. Greg actually oversaw all of the analysis of the United States intelligence community, and he set up a think tank looking at how cyber world is affecting guys making decisions, both public and private sector. Because part of the problem right now is you're just awash in the stuff. I've got an iPhone that's seemingly located about 10 feet away from me, with all kinds of apps on it and all kinds of information that I didn't have 10 years ago. You guys are going to be the first generation that are going to have to live with universal information. And that doesn't always lend itself well to decision making, in part because you can fool with the information, in part because it's selectivity of information, depending on what you're interested in. So Greg's going to be talking about that, and again, we talked about some of the other guys who are talking about different parts of the private sector as well. Randy deals a lot with how a Raytheon Corporation, a major contractor, tries to support the U.S. government in terms of the kind of cyberspace issues. I mean, there are two parts of cyberspace. One is, so my friend Mike calls it pipes and water. The water is the information, the pipes are the IT systems. As we all noticed in Iowa the other day, the pipes broke down, okay? The water was there, but the pipes broke down. How do you deal with that when you're dealing with sort of fast-moving events and decision-making that you need to make? So Stephanie will talk a little bit about how the United States military deals with it. Because the U.S. military is looking for total information domination in the field. Yeah. Because that's how they roll. That is their advantage. But they can be, so are the Russians, and so are the Chinese. And so Mark Lowenthal and some of the others are going to talk about how the Russians and Chinese are dealing with this, because we concentrate on non-nation state for a long time, like ISIS and all that. Bad news is that the Russians, who I thought I had defeated, are back, big time. And it's a real leverage in terms of, it doesn't cost much to do this, but you can do a lot of damage. And if you don't think so, you'll notice that we're still talking about the 2016 election here on what was essentially a pretty cheap operation on their part. So that's really covering the field. This is about information, this is about intelligence, this is about public sector, it's about private sector. I think it's a good broad spread. And I hope everybody has a chance to come. I mean, I always know how difficult it is. You're in the middle of the term, and you're trying to get all your stuff done. It's Wednesday afternoons at 4 o'clock, I believe it is. It's over at the Dole Institute, which is on the other side of campus over here. And I really invite everybody to come. It's going to be very informal. I mean, I'm going to be sitting there pretty much like you and I are right now, sans the table. We're going to have chairs out there, and I encourage people to come and ask questions. This is not about hearing the beauties of my voice. This is about hearing the guests, but also hearing the questions that they want to ask.
Well, it sounds great. Ron, thank you so much for being here with us today.
You're entirely welcome. Delighted to do it.
We'll be right back after the break.